This week I'm taking a look at the 1984 sci-fi movie Dune, directed by David Lynch and based off of the novel by Frank Herbert. I've never actually seen this movie before, but I have seen 2021's Dune Part 1 and I really enjoyed that movie, so I'm kind of curious how this movie holds up compared to that one. Because what I really liked about Dune Part 1 was the characters and the setting and the story to that, and the effects were obviously really good in that movie, but that was kind of a background to everything else that I enjoyed about that movie. So since this movie is still based off of the same novel, that surely I should actually enjoy this one too. As long as it's executed properly, then everything should work out just fine. But I know David Lynch is kind of a bit more of an artistic type of director. I'm not super familiar with a lot of his work. I have only seen Blue Velvet, and while I did enjoy that movie when I watched it, it was years ago and I can't remember a ton about it other than Dennis Hopper huffing on a tank of, I don't know, some type of drugs and always drinking PBR.
Pabst Blue Ribbon!
So did I like this movie? Not quite. And it's actually kind of difficult because when I was watching this, it's one of those things like, okay, I like the characters, I like the story, but what really happened was just the execution kind of fell short in a bunch of different ways. And it wasn't anything really major either. It was just kind of missing the mark in a bunch of little ways. And when you add them all up, it knocks it down in my book. One of the biggest issues I had with this is the pacing of the movie, because around 2 hours long in the first act of the movie takes up about half of the movie. And then the second and third act just kind of get jumbled together, which I think is kind of a disservice to it. Not to mention it kind of ends anticlimactically and just abruptly. And I was kind of like, oh, well, that's it. Well, okay, I guess that's the end of it for now. And I think it could have actually done better if they trimmed down the first act a little bit more and actually focused a little bit more on the second act when he's working with the Fremen and engaging in his guerrilla war against the Empire. Because if it wasn't for Paul's sister in the movie, you wouldn't necessarily even feel like any time has really passed. It just kind of seems like it's almost a couple months. I think you could have developed that a little bit better and made it seem like more time has actually occurred and this war was going on for a lot longer than what it appears in the movie. But unfortunately, trimming down in the first act would mean cutting down a lot of the world building, and that's why it drags on a little bit longer. I'm not really sure what the solution is. I'd probably have to go back and be real thorough with how I would actually tackle this, but I think you could have actually cut down on some things because there are a little bit more redundancies that don't need to be addressed in the first act of the movie that I think took away from things later on. I thought the overall production design was actually pretty good because this does look like a sci-fi otherworldly appearance to it. But this is kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about how certain things just kind of just fall short of what I really would prefer, because even though I like a lot of the settings, I like a lot of the costumes, it does feel kind of cheap and almost, theater-esque, if you will, where the settings look very much like settings. They don't necessarily look like actual worlds that people would live in. The costumes look like costumes. They don't look like something that people would actually wear. They don't look like clothing. And that's kind of where I have a little bit of a gripe with it. And maybe it's a nitpick and I'm fully willing to admit that, but I'm thinking maybe they were kind of going for the whole pulpy sci-fi aesthetic of this because that's kind of what Dune was originating from. So maybe they were trying to reimagine that, but in the 80s, I just don't think it worked. At least it didn't for me. For the most part, I'll say the performances in this movie were serviceable. I mean, there was nothing really spectacular, but nothing really terrible except for one that I'll get to in a moment. I thought everyone seemed to fit their part of the character they were playing. The only gripe I have is at times the acting seemed to be a little bit too much like a soap opera. It was very cheesy, but I'm going to give it a pass on that one because it didn't distract me too much from it. And I thought for the most part they were trying to go for that 1950s sci-fi aesthetic. I don't think it really worked with the costumes and the settings like I already said, but I think as far as the performances go, it was okay. The only gripe I do have about the performances, though, is the actor, I forget his name, who played Baron Harkonnen. And I think he went a little bit too overboard with the cheesy villain aspect of it, because even though I know that's kind of a choice that they were doing for the movie, I think he stood out particularly because every time it cuts back to him, it just feels like a tonally different movie altogether. And it really took me out of it because even though the other characters, I can kind of enjoy the cheesy aspect of it, I think for him, it was like, okay, dude, just kind of tone it down a little bit. And I get he's supposed to be kind of a vile and disgusting type of character who's just pure evil and stuff like that. But still, I mean, an evil character who's vile and disgusting is more threatening and more intimidating if you can actually make him seem more realistic. And he was just coming across as just a cartoon character. Another thing I didn't really care for in regards to the performance was the voiceovers that they would have throughout the movie. And I understand this is adapting from a novel, and I'm assuming there's a lot of VO throughout that where you can actually hear the internal monologue of the characters. But in film, it doesn't really work out as well. And I don't think that you can't have it, but you just have to be selective on how you choose to implement it instead of just having you constantly hear their thoughts. And it did seem a little redundant when a lot of times they're just saying something that you as an audience member could already figure out from the situations. Like, for instance, you can have a scene where an actor walks into a room with someone else in there. Then the person in there will be like, "He just entered the room. I wonder what he wants." What do you want? It's like, I know, I get it. You don't need to spell it out for me like that. I thought the effects in this movie looked decent for the time frame, and I'm not necessarily comparing it to modern movies or the new one because that really wouldn't be a fair comparison. I'm trying to think of it in terms of how it looked compared to other movies of the time, and even though it wasn't great because Return of the Jedi came out a year earlier and I think it looked better, this one I think a lot of the stuff like the sandworm held up pretty well. I like the effects they used for the Fremen eyes in this one, and I can really appreciate the effort it must have taken to hand rotoscope out the eyes in each frame to get the Fremen eyes for this movie. I know some people have said that it's not accurate to the book, where it's supposed to be more of a saturation of blue as opposed to a blue glow, but I think it worked for what they were trying to go for. Some of the effects I didn't like, though, was the energy shields that they had, and it's clearly a 1980s early CGI that they were using for that, and it just looked really phony and just kind of laughable. But fortunately, it's only a couple points in the movie where they actually show it, but I would argue they probably should have figured out some other way to come up with the energy shields as opposed to the method that they used. I did like a lot of the music in this movie, though, particularly the scene when Paul first rides the sandworm. I know it's kind of cheesy the way it finally builds up and then crescendos and everything like that, but still, I think it's a good amount of cheesy, and I think the rest of the movie should have been kind of along that line versus feeling a little bit all over the place at times. Overall, I thought the movie was decent, but it did lose a couple points in my book because of the way they executed it. The biggest flaw, I say first and foremost, was the pacing of it, and I heard the director's cut of this movie was an hour longer, and I think with that extra hour, they could have fleshed things out and made things flow a little bit better than what we actually got in the final product, because what we ended up with was a first half of the movie that kind of dragged out longer than it needed to, and then the second and third act of the movie were basically just rushing to completion. If that was fixed, and probably some of the other things that I had problems with, like the hokey acting and the cheap looking sets and things like that, I could probably see recommending this with a 7 out of 10, but the way the movie stands, I'd probably give it a 5 out of 10. It's nothing spectacular, but nothing terrible either. It's just kind of middle of the road, unless you like this kind of cheesy hokiness to sci-fi movies, and I'm sure you'll probably enjoy it a lot better than I did. But let me know what you think about this movie in the comment section below, and if you like this video, make sure you click that like button, share the video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want to stay up to date with the latest in entertainment news and see more of my movie reviews.